A Way That Things Should Be by LullabyKnell. Chapter 2. The Improper Party. There is a dwarf that has, using his knock, barging entrance, dusty boot prints, and eating of Bilbo's own meal, claimed new ownership of Bag End from Bilbo according to 9 of the 22 traditions that haven't been commonly or widely used since the times of Bulwer Took. He has also, through many of his gestures, called Bilbo's home a rotting pile of tastelessness, become engaged to himself, insulted Bilbo's dinnerware set by deeming it unworthy of a duckling, told Bilbo that his carpets need more salt, and propositioned a service of sexual acts between them. 7 times now in regards to the propositions. In increasingly bizarre and horrifying ways too. Bilbo didn't even know that people did that, or why anyone would want to involve fireplace pokers in the bedroom in the first place. That didn't seem sanitary. That couldn't possibly be sanitary, and it was definitely not safe. Oh, hills, what? Bilbo Baggins has followed the proper ways all his life. He has long since mastered the art of holding 2 or more conversations at once, and keeping spoken and unspoken conversations separate. But now they seem to be betraying him, as he has scandal upon unadulterated horror shoved in his face. The dwarf doesn't seem to be picking up on any of Bilbo's unspoken objections and responses to his unspoken claim of ownership of Bag End, and he equally seems to be ignoring Bilbo's spoken objections to the dwarf just walking in, asking where the others and the food are, and sitting down without being invited. Either way, Bilbo is being ignored, and he finds it as bewilderingly as it is insulting. Because being ignored, it doesn't really get much worse than that in any kind of hobbitish. Then the doorbell rings again, in such a way that Bilbo is once again caught between indignation and confusion, because his front path is not as unwelcoming as a pile of used washcloths, and who in the Shire would dare say something like that about him and his late mother, besides his Aunt Camilla? And also, to be fair, besides most of the Baggins family and a good number of Tooks. Look, Hobbitish isn't a nice language. Belladonna Took was a menace, and Bilbo himself isn't exactly the most outgoing and tolerant of individuals. It's not actually that unexpected or rare. It's just really rude that the insult would be used as an opening zinger, because now that Bilbo's parents have both passed away, that's really more of a half an hour into tea sort of statement by someone he actually knows. The answer, it turns out to be, is not someone from the Shire. There is mud on Bilbo's mother's glory box and dirt trod into his carpets, essentially proclaiming Bag End filthy and worthless, and in general terrible taste by the older, proper ways that haven't been used outside of the absolute worst feuds for decades at least. Bilbo is ready to cry because he has never seen such blatant disrespect and insult to a hobbit and their home. His carpet patterns are not ugly, and his coat hooks are not crooked. His dusting is flawless, thank you. And he's not sure what leeches have to do with anything, but he does not have an infestation in his cheese cabinet. Where are these dwarves coming from? They're eating his food and thus calling themselves his new family, and yet they're rearranging his furniture for supper in such a way that is really only appropriate for a grieving ceremony. But there's no mourning, because these dwarfs are acting like there is to be a wedding. Bilbo has seen 2 couples and 1 triad start courting or becoming betrothed. Wait, make that 3 couples. Actually, that dwarf was part of the triad, so... Bilbo is so confused. He knows nothing about dwarves, much less dwarf relationships, but he is quite sure that there are at least slightly more monogamous than this. It's impossible to make any kind of sense with these dwarves. They say ridiculous things and then don't act on them because most of them aren't even remotely plausible, and the rest is sheer madness. Something seems to have been lost in translation, honestly, because most of their actions don't seem to correspond to any piece or sort of coherent hobbitish that Bilbo is familiar with, which leaves massive gaps between the random things they declare. Which is incredible, really, because then Bilbo at least gets some sort of break from witnessing yet another piece of pure horror. If only the dwarves could stop ignoring his every attempt at asking what the hills is going on, spoken aloud and silently, for hill's sake. They're all so much larger than him. Their movements are stronger and rougher, their clothes and appearances don't match the images of proper ways, gestures that Bilbo has known for as long as he can remember. It's like meeting far northern hobbits, only 1,000 times worse. Their actions are so much more unrefined, unplanned. Dwarves and gentle hobbits are not at all cut from the same cloth, and Bilbo wishes they would stop this madness long enough for him to get a proper look at everything and maybe manage to fit their differences to the proper ways that he knows. But the one with the funny hat is proposing romantic acts of devotion be committed with Bilbo's doilies to everyone in the vicinity. The young brunette is accusing Aunt Belba's hideous vase of being haunted. The blonde next to him is carefully letting him, his own brother, know that it is not the brunette's fault, it is the blonde's own issues, and that the blonde has enjoyed their time together, but now marry sensibly for the honour of the family cow. Or maybe it's family river pebble. Bilbo isn't sure because interpreting such a long and straight and complexly braided hair is very difficult, and the process of elimination by what makes less sense isn't actually applicable here. Then the one with the ear trumpet is communicating that Bilbo's window curtain should have at least half a dozen more blueberries, and the copper-bearded one next to him keeps threatening to punch out the nearest chair legs for no real reason. The white-bearded one is eating quite happily while also clearly of the opinion that Bilbo's food is the worst thing he's ever smelled. And all the others are just as rude and nonsensical, commenting that the plates look like limp lettuce, or that there's a 50-foot-tall people-eating rock coming from across the Brandywine another half-moon now. Gandalf is here too, but he's not making any sense either, and Bilbo is just so lost. The gentle hobbit has, thus far, been compared to both fine wine and a piece of spinach in looks and dress. He's received 13 job offers for everything from a portrait artist to living hunting bait. He's been proposed to 19 times and propositioned 41 times. He's been told that he's a pen without ink, a lacy rabbit, and a drunken teapot of a host. And he's been challenged to 15 fights so far, 7 cooking, 4 gardening, 2 conkers, 1 smoke rings, and 1 pie-eating contest to the death. One of the dwarves even threatened the hobbit's shirt buttons before helping himself to Bilbo's best peppers, and then communicated oh so casually that the peppers needed more time over the fire for better taste. Also, Bilbo really ought to find himself a nice goat and settle down already in the back garden's dahlias, Despite, of course, the back garden not having any dahlias, Bilbo is so confused. Gandalf even has the gall to grin at him like this breaching of the proper ways is funny. Like it's just the most hilarious thing that the wizard has ever seen, to have the youngling vocally asking what to do with his plate while simultaneously gesturing that he will crack eggs down Bilbo's best shirt unless the hobbit fetches him fish for second breakfast. As for the singing and the plate throwing, Bilbo isn't even going to go there. No, really, he's not. If he does anything but immediately refuse to remember that it happened, someone is going to have to die. So it never happened. So there. By the time the last member of the dwarf company rings the bell, Bilbo has stopped being horrified, flustered, and confused long enough to properly realize that these dwarves don't actually know the proper ways. They can't know. It's just like his Took and Brandy but cousin said. Everything they're saying in Hobbitish is unintentional and meaningless to them. Which actually explains why no one really reacted to the 8 different times someone declared themselves or someone else to be pregnant. Bilbo has had so many questions about dwarf anatomy and some wonderings about dwarvish gender presentation, but he's very glad no longer immediately applied now that the threat of someone immediately going into labor is false. So while Bilbo is very relieved that therefore none of their comments had any authenticity, especially that one about the flying horses in the pond, dear hills, that one stumped him completely, and while the hobbit fully understood that the rest of the world did things differently, well, it is another thing together to actually experience it. Especially when a knock comes at the door, sharp and silencing, announcing a 13th dwarvish guest who is late. What the knock meant in Hobbitish, Bilbo shall not say, for it was unimportant given that it meant nothing and absolutely paled in comparison to the Hobbitish that followed. A regal dwarf, not the eldest, but with hair beginning to grey, steps into Bag End and immediately accidentally proclaims ownership by 3.5 of the elder proper ways, just like the first dwarf did. Every little bit of him and his Hobbitish is shouting unimpressed comments about what he's seeing, and the first thing the dwarf does when he finally looks at Bilbo is insult him verbally. Bilbo is a gentle hobbit, not some common grocer that's an insult for friendly acquaintances, at the very least, and also unintentionally tells the hobbit via the proper ways that the dwarf hopes sickness befalls Bilbo's herb garden and that he's planning Bilbo's most agonizing demise with a sugar spoon. Bilbo may possibly sort of eep in fear at that. It's not every day someone threatens to gouge out his eyeballs and eat them. Maybe every other month in the expected places, like when his tomatoes win first place at the annual fair again, and being threatened by Mrs. Hardbottle, who was a great-grandmother and not even 3 feet tall, is not at all the same as being threatened by a tall, dark, and intimidating dwarf warrior. They are very different experiences. To the dwarves, however, it probably appears as though Bilbo is irrationally terrified of everything, and all that thought does for Bilbo is make his terror and embarrassment worse. Why is this happening to him? He's a relatively decent person. He doesn't deserve this. It is painstakingly obvious that none of the dwarves are at all impressed with the hobbit, especially this dark Thorin Oakenshield fellow. But they have not a clue just how incredible it is that Bilbo hasn't yet run screaming from Bag End. Any other hobbit probably would have fainted, dead off their feet, hours and hours ago. Bilbo has not. Although the only reason he hasn't done just that is that he is running entirely on pure fear and survival instincts at the moment. Bilbo may also be holding out hope that this is just a very realistic hallucination. His cousin Aldegrim sneaked some of those terrible mushrooms they'd found once upon a time into Bilbo's soup again. The Baggins hobbits knew it. Any moment now he would open his eyes and there would no longer be any dwarves telling him that his potatoes are too spicy and that his cheese knife bit them. Any moment. Nope. Damn. A hobbit can dream. Bilbo tries to keep in mind that clearly none of the dwarves are aware of Hobbitish's silent aspects or the proper ways, and that he needs to focus on only what is being said instead of tiny gestures and specific movements. Trying to read their body language is hard, especially when he keeps seeing his body language that doesn't apply. It's difficult, and Bilbo is having terrible trouble keeping track of what's going on around him. By no stretch of the imagination can Bilbo not communicate excellently with spoken or written words, but the lack of background commentary and freedom of expression using tiny gestures is throwing him off. It is said that everyone knows everybody else's business in the Shire, and that is true, mostly because the proper ways encourage an openness of speech that regular speech just doesn't have. There are some things hobbits just do not speak aloud, which is very hypocritical and nonsensical, but proper hobbitish lets them say almost anything they like. Some things just aren't said or asked aloud. They aren't. It'd be so rude, and Bilbo is nothing if not a proper gentle hobbit. The Shire is a world constant chatter and communication and conversation, but these dwarves, they are either unnervingly silent or their communication is unrecognizable to him and his proper ways. There are nuances here, subtle nuances that Bilbo knows he's missing and doesn't understand and doesn't know how to recognize. There is important business going on here, he knows that, and it seems very personal. They speak of gold and glory, yes, but underneath that, well, he doesn't know. On the surface, it all sounds very exciting. That's all Bilbo can say, since he can't rely on any more information from the small movements and gestures and actions of these dwarves. Without anyone honestly communicating their thoughts and feelings and opinions in Hobbitish, save for Bilbo himself, who could not have ceased following the proper ways without serious conscious effort that was currently a bit beyond him. The Hobbit finds it difficult to take this seriously. As exciting as this quest sounds, it also sounds fantastical, vague, shallow, and generally unreal to him. Trying desperately to ignore the connotations of being directly handed so important a document by someone's right hand while standing, Bilbo glances over the contract he cannot really believe that he's holding. The wording is complex and he can't really concentrate on deciphering it when Thorin Oakenshield is eating his meal and holding a utensil like that. And that's on top of the distraction of the rest of the dwarves still letting Bilbo know things that he is a slug in his candle and his buttons are inside out, and that one of them has come to the decision that they separate because the marriage really isn't working and their children can move between their homes freely because friendship is important. Bilbo isn't really sure what causes him to faint in the end, the idea of being incinerated by a dragon, or because the dwarf with the silver hair proposed an orgy in Bilbo's dining room. Then the one with the pointy hair threatened to knock Bilbo's meal down and set the Shire on fire, before signaling that he thought that was a grand idea. And there's always something said aloud about a dragon. It doesn't really matter whether or not Bilbo's mind knows that all the dwarves' hobbitish is nonsense, and they aren't really saying that, because they technically really are, and oh my, everything is black now, and hello, floor. Bilbo agrees to go on the quest. He's not sure why exactly, because it means that he pretty much signed himself up for almost certain death and complete certain continuation of unintentional compliments, insults, death threats, marriage proposals, sexual and sensual favour offerings, and nonsensical comments about there not being enough cream in his bacon or that his sixth toe is looking particularly lovely today. But there's something fascinating here, something he can't resist. Bilbo's always loved stories of the world outside the Shire, of people and cultures and wonders, and the strangeness surrounding him now, the sheer oddity and potential, is intoxicating. He has always loved puzzles and language. Actions speak louder than words. Hobbitish is so very precise, so very ordered. There can't be a finger out of place or a teacup placed down at the wrong angle or a bite of cake taken at the wrong moment. It's so complicated that even gentle hobbits get it terribly wrong quite often, which inspires arguments and feuds and disasters on an exhaustingly regular basis. Bilbo cannot really imagine a life without the proper ways, but looking at these dwarves stamping down on being scandalized and horrified, Bilbo wonders what it must be like to not have to be proper all the time, and to have different ideas of respectability and tradition. These dwarves have their own movements and expressions that mean things clearly, but they're so raw and alien and unfamiliar to Bilbo. Hobbits are not so restricted that they cannot be spontaneous or must conceal their joy, but Hobbitish has very specific outlets for that, and these dwarves have an entirely different set of rules governing the way they gesture and laugh and clap backs, all entirely oblivious to the offensive nonsense they're saying in Hobbitish. They're so foreign, so outside, so dwarvish. It's so much freer, it's so loud, it's so very, very intriguing, now that Bilbo has had a moment to think. Their emotional expression is rougher, apparently less restricted, and Bilbo is more envious than he's horrified, and more curious than he is envious. And, well, then that song might have cinched it for him, deep and rumbling, long and low, thick and rich, with a faraway home, and a lost history and a fateful hope. Adventure beckoned in that song, the exploration of a world where nothing will be the same called in that song. Bilbo could still hear it, even just in Thorin's humming in the bedroom next door, loud enough to haunt his fitful dreams. And he listened to this language he did not know, with more fervour than the rest of his life combined, because this is exciting, and some part of him quietly recognized that this is important. This is so much more important than how many flowers went into a crown of daisies for it to be for a sweetheart instead of a friend. This is so much more important than whether or not there's a sprinkling of sugar on a tart and the exact position of peas on the dinner table. This is so much more important than how to hold a spoon to purposely insult your brunch host versus your lunch host. And marriage proposals and unintentional intimate propositions aside, Bilbo wants in.